Okay, fabulous. So we've had a few technology issues, but it looks like we're up and running. And so welcome everyone to this evening's program. We've been running a series centered around vintage cocktails, and in each case trying to provide some sort of overarching historical context. And this evening we have Catherine Oliver below you on the screen. If you could just wave, Catherine. Catherine is the administrative assistant for the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. I myself am Dr. James Broomall, the director of the center, as well as an associate professor of history at Shepherd University. And we are joined by a special guest, Katlin McCreery. Katlin is an alumna of Shepherd University. She was one of my students, and I must say I'm extraordinarily proud of Katlin. She just made remarkable progress over the course of her time at Shepherd, and just an absolutely fabulous capstone presentation and paper on mourning rituals in the 19th century, which is very apropos. And Katlin herself works at Frontier Culture just outside of Stanton, am I saying Stanton, Virginia, which is an absolutely wonderful living history museum. If you haven't been there, they do wonderful interpretation, and Katlin is stationed at the antebellum era Virginia farm. Is that correct? On a typical period of time, not right now. Yes. Okay. And so what we'll do then is talk a bit broadly this evening about mourning rituals in the 19th century. And we will go from there. I want to make sure I get the page up here so I can see you all making comments as we go. We will go as we go along. So just bear with me here. Again, I'm using some different technologies this evening, having a little bit more trouble than I normally would. Okay, we're great. Okay, we got some friends already tuning in. Jan Hafer from Shepherdstown, welcome. Rick Wolf from West Virginia, longtime supporter of the center. We're extraordinarily happy to have you all here this evening, as well as the rest of you. I hope this video finds you healthy and well. And to start this presentation this evening, I'd like to draw from a primary source before I turn it over at first to Catherine. And I think I'm very compelled by primary source materials. They just, I think, speak to audiences in very powerful ways. And for me, as soon as this discussion was offered as a topic, this idea of mourning and death in the 19th century, I thought immediately of a diary that I had read at the University of Virginia. Their special collections is subterranean. It's a very comfortable space, and I've spent at this point many weeks there. And this particular collection are known as the Marcus Blakemore Buck Diaries. The diary itself is a small leather-bound volume dated to 1855, and the collection runs, the entries rather, run through the antebellum and Civil War era. Buck had a son who served in the Confederate cavalry, and he has this incredibly compelling entry from June 22nd, 1863. This is at the very beginning of the Pennsylvania campaign. And just bear with me here for a minute. I think this entry is worth reading. Quote, at about 1:00 p.m., I received a note from my brother William informing me that my dear precious boy Walter had been wounded in the Cav fight at Upperville today. And this refers to Upperville, Virginia. I immediately got on my horse and started in that direction by way of Barry's Ferry. Very soon the fatal truth was communicated to me, first by wounded soldiers returning, and a few miles further on in letters from cousins Horace and Isaac. My firstborn son, my pride, had fallen by a shot fired from the enemy while making a charge for the protection of Chew's battery. God supported me, and I went up nearly to Upperville, where I met cousin Cloud and Harry Cloud. They returned to Paris, Virginia, obtained a wagon, and we went to the scene of the deadly encounter. The grave in which my son had been placed was immediately where he fell, and was one made hastily by the enemy before falling back that night after battle. There was but one other grave on that part of the field. The means for the preparing of the body were obtained, and by the light of a lantern, he, his cousins, and two strangers, the lifelike body of my lately buoyant, joyous boy was exhumed and prepared for removal. And I'll stop there, but this letter, I think, gives us some sense of the powerful emotions that 19th century Americans felt as they encountered death during the American Civil War. Now we'll try to keep the topic relatively light, if that's possible, by trying to interject some more enjoyable components, I guess. But mourning is a quite serious matter, and it has a very specific pattern, a very specific series of rituals that are practiced in the 19th century. So we're going to rehearse those rituals. We're going to talk about those rituals. We're going to have Katlin demonstrate the different stages of mourning in the 19th century through period costuming. And I think we're going to just talk more broadly about death in the 19th century. And so with that, somber beginning, I'm going to turn it over to Katlin, who's going to introduce this evening's cocktail, give us some historical context, which is going to globalize this particular drink, and talk a bit about relations between Great Britain and the United States at the very beginning of the Civil War, and we'll sort of take it from there. So with that, Katlin.
Thanks, Jim. So yes, a whole lot in one little drink that we're going to talk about this evening. The drink of the night is something called the Black Velvet. And as we think about mourning, I can't imagine something that would seem so dreary as this black velvet just sort of cloaking the world of a house in mourning. This cocktail originates in 1861. Now, this is not an American concoction. It comes to us from our friends across the Atlantic in Great Britain. And it is created in that country by a bartender who, with all of his countrymen and their queen, are mourning the loss of their prince, Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria, who dies of typhoid fever in 1861. And Queen Victoria becomes quite renowned in a way for her grieving for years over the loss of Prince Albert, her husband. And some people will actually begin to complain a little bit about her mourning. But one invention, if you will, that comes out of this in response to Prince Albert's death is the Black Velvet cocktail. It's very simple. It's the simplest one that I have introduced you all to so far in this series. It has two ingredients, a little sparkling wine or champagne, if you will, and a little bit of stout beer. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. So I've already poured my sparkling wine into this champagne flute, which is not Victorian, I apologize. And basically that's what you do. Sorry. We have our expert on the period below, and she's going to outshine me tonight in mourning.
Right.
I wasn't even going to try. Katlin, this is all you here. So I have my modern champagne flute already filled, and you fill it about halfway. And again, champagne or just any sparkling wine of your choice. And then you're just going to take your stout beer, which I've poured into a handy little pitcher so that I don't splatter beer all over myself on Facebook Live.
When you say a stout beer, so we're talking something like a porter, a stout. Okay.
Yeah. So this you just pour right on top. And I don't know if you can see it. It does create a little bit of foaminess at the top. I don't know if that's really showing up that well, but that's essentially what it is. And there you have it. Some people like to see the layers as they develop, or you can stir it if you want to mix up the flavors. It will kind of settle, the stout will settle in naturally, and the bubbles of your sparkling drink of choice will rise up, and it will kind of blend together. You don't never want to stir something with champagne or sparkling wine too much. That's not going to help your drink too well. So if you like to let it sit and just enjoy the mixtures of bubbles and foam and contemplate the loss of your prince, if you will. So we do have perhaps a cause in America to consider Prince Albert's death. He actually does have a connection to the American Civil War. His last official state act as prince is possibly diffusing what could have been a completely devastating incident in the relationship between the United States and Britain. In 1861, the war is young. It has already devastated so many American lives as we're moving through 1861. We're just beginning to get a sense of how bad this might be. And really the last thing that we need at this point, that either side really needs, is another war with a foreign power. And that's almost what occurs in 1861. It's called the Trent Affair, and some of you may be quite familiar with this incident already. It's a diplomatic crisis of major proportions. What happens is, as if you're familiar with basic Civil War chronology here, I can say words, there is a blockade of the southern ports, and the South is interested in getting some emissaries to Great Britain to make their case for support, either military support, which would be really helpful, or just support with supplies, trade relationships. So the South endeavors to maneuver a few representatives, liaisons, first out of the southern ports. They go, I believe, to Cuba first, and then they're going to get on another ship and head to Britain. And while they're on this journey, they make it on board a British ship, and they are en route to Great Britain. And the British ship is intercepted by the US Navy. Now, there are a bunch of rules about how this is supposed, what are we supposed to do in this situation? The US and Great Britain are not at war. The US demands that these Confederate representatives be handed over. They demand any diplomatic pouches that may be on board. There are things the US Navy could have done in this situation that they didn't do, but basically they do confiscate these individuals. They board the ship. They're not able to find the papers because those are hidden, but this is seen as such an insult to the British Crown, and they're outraged that their ship has been invaded. And what happens when news reaches London, the British people are furious. They are absolutely furious that the Americans, who are boasting about the incident, who are celebrating what has happened, look what we've done. When the news in Britain is just fury. And the advisors to the Crown, the advisors in Parliament are trying to find a solution, and their solution is not friendly to the United States. They send, as they are required to do, several reports to the Queen, several recommendations to Queen Victoria about what to do next. It's not pretty, but someone intercepts those letters. and that's Prince Albert. And Prince Albert takes those letters, reads them, sees the disaster that this could be. And we don't know exactly Prince Albert's opinions on the entire Civil War, but to give you some background, he's a German actually by his heritage. He is rather a foreigner in England throughout his time as Queen Victoria's husband. His first political act in England is delivering an anti-slavery speech. And his last political act is rewriting the Queen's, on behalf of the Queen, rewriting the directions essentially to Parliament in how to handle and negotiate this. What he does is give President Abraham Lincoln a way out. Oh, your officers must have somehow confused their orders. We don't believe that you, President Lincoln, would have directly ordered this. We're sure that this is all a misunderstanding, is basically what Prince Albert does. He gives he allows there to be a polite and safe exit for the United States to resolve this diplomatically, and everyone is set back to rights. And we do not engage in war with Great Britain in 1861, as well as engaging in war between the states, and disaster is averted. So if you would like to toast Prince Albert for assisting in quelling disaster at that time, thank you, Prince Albert. As I said, that was his very last act. He died within days of interceding in that event. So just a brief summary, but Queen Victoria will not forget Prince Albert. The entire nation is in mourning, and she really sets the standard for high-level mourning rituals that will be reflected on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think Katlin can tell us much more about that.
Wonderful. And before doing so, Catherine, I think it is useful to pause here just for a moment. And thank you for that powerful summary. And many of you know, the issue of Great Britain's involvement in the war remains sort of undecided, really, through 1862. The Maryland campaign proves very decisive in sort of shifting sentiment on the other side of the Atlantic as to whether or not they're going to intervene on the behalf of the Confederacy or intervene at all in trying to suggest some sort of peace. But as I was talking to Catherine about vintage cocktails and trying to find something from the Civil War era, you said something that I had no idea, and that is that the first, I guess, bartender's guide is actually published in the midst of the Civil War in 1862. So can you just ever so briefly tell us about that? Because I thought that was incredibly interesting, and I had, again, no idea that that was the case.
Yeah, so it's a really fascinating book. I don't have it. I forgot to bring it over here with me. It's way off in my kitchen. What I have is actually a reprint of the 1862 version, which is kind of cool. You can see all of the 19th century typeface and illustrations. So just generally about 19th century cocktails, the Americans are described as constantly reinventing cider.
Right.
And constantly reinventing punches. Okay. And really the cocktails are coming to light, as we see in Great Britain and in Italy. And the Europeans are a little more advanced, I guess, with their drinking at this point. But yeah, this book is published in 1862. And what's important to note about it is that it's published in 1862 as the first collection of cocktail recipes. So everything that's in there is actually much older. The book contains several of these classic punch recipes that we know from our colonial experiences in America. Things like the mint julep and other forms of the julep are recorded in it. And many other things that these aren't 1862 cocktails that are in this book. Sure. They are 18th century and 17th century. So it's really, it's a fascinating time capsule because it's a first attempt, this is something of interest. It's a piece of culture. We want to gather these recipes together. And so that's where it comes from.
And we're going to turn her to Katlin here in a second, but that's this broader impulse. I mean, Diderot creates this massive encyclopedia in France in the age of the Enlightenment, where you're trying to really understand everything from shoemaking to astronomy and anatomy. And you see that impulse emerging throughout the early to mid 19th century, where people are for the first time sort of formulating these workwomen's guides for sewing, for instance, a household economy. They're formulating recipe books. Tailors for the first time are publishing sort of manuals as to how one is to cut out a garment. And I think it's this impulse that emerges from the 18th century. But as Catherine said, in many cases, this is knowledge that had probably been passed through families, perhaps for even generations. And so there is this sort of timeless quality to elements of all of this. But I do want to get into the nature of mourning. And so the diary entry that I read for you from Marcus Buck conveys that first moment of shock and horror. In this case, he learns in this quick sequence of events, first about his son's wounding and about his son's death. He goes quickly to the battlefield because he's able to do so. He exhumes the body, returns it to a family plot. And this is a pretty common practice when families are able to do so. And there's some really interesting discussions the Civil War Medicine has had on some of their social media about transporting the dead, about trying to preserve bodies and things of that sort. But then there's this longer process with which 19th century Americans and those in Great Britain must grapple with. How does one, properly mourn the dead? What's the place? What's the role of loved ones in the afterlife? And this has both gendered dimensions and very specific cultural context. And as I said at the beginning of tonight, Katlin, again, I was just extraordinarily proud of the research that she did over the course of her time at Shepherd. And she just wrote an absolutely fabulous capstone paper, which is the culminating project for undergraduates here at Shepherd on mourning rituals in the 19th century. She looked specifically at some original extant garments, talked about the cultural context for mourning. And so just broadly, Katlin, for people who are tuning in, they see Catherine and I, we look relatively normal, and then they see you, always normal, of course. But can you just tell us briefly what exactly it is that you're wearing, and then we'll start getting to some of the nuts and the more particulars of mourning. So what are you wearing here, Katlin?
So basically what I'm wearing is the deepest stage of mourning. Mourning in itself had those technically three stages. But what I'm wearing is the deepest stage possible because it's not just cotton, but it's also got an overlayering of crepe. So it's kind of starting with that, and then jewelry and stuff adds to that deepest layering. The earliest stage, this is what everyone would be wearing as soon as possible after the death, women-wise at least.
And it might be useful. It might be useful to pause here and just discuss. There is a very important gendered dimension to mourning, correct? And so how would one know that an 1863 era male was in mourning, or could they know that a man was in mourning from outward projection?
Typically for gentlemen, you would wear the darkest suit that you had, whether it be a dark gray or a black. And you would also have crepe armbands, possibly crepe sewn onto the brim of your hat. But past that, that's about all the gentlemen had to do. They also had shorter time frames that they had to deal with it. So it was highly gendered, because the exact opposite of that is I'm obviously in all black, and I would be for a year and a day if I were wearing this for a husband. So
And I think it's useful to go on then and talk about these different stages, because again, this is a very complex process, and we should note at the beginning here that what the social ideal is can often only be embodied or enacted by middle and upper class women. I think there are a lot of genuine attempts lower classes to do what they're able to do, but I mean, in some cases, if we're talking about a yeoman farmer's family, what they have in terms of material might be very limited. But let's maybe set the bar high and talk about what the ideal is in these different stages of mourning.
So basically, your first stage is what I'm wearing now with all of the crepe, and then throughout the time frame for deep mourning, you're progressively getting rid of the crepe and adding little bits of silver and gold jewelry. You can wear a little bit more color by the end, which then leads into the second stage of mourning, which is half mourning. Half mourning, you can start wearing a lot more color, where you can typically, what you find today, remnants wise, is grays, blues, some really dark greens, and purples. Purple and blue seem to be the most popular that they would wear, just because of how dark you could get that color.
Mm-hmm.
And then if she so chose, you would then come out of mourning, which typically depended on your age. Younger girls would obviously throw mourning to the side as soon as possible, whereas older ladies would end up, in most cases, wearing it until the day they themselves died. That last stage, you're just going back to your normal wardrobe for the most part. You might still wear the mourning brooches. You'll have hair jewelry that you could wear, but past that, there's no real signs of mourning anymore.
And I think, so we're going to talk a bit about what that means in terms of social behavior here in a second. But there's a question about what crepe is. So you've thrown out some terms maybe that are a little technical for some people. So can you just quickly define that?
Basically, crepe is either silk or wool material that is see-through. Mm-hmm. It's really loosely weaved together, and because of the materials it is, it's going to have bigger and smaller threads in it that specifically makes it a crepe.
Okay.
The crepe itself is actually where the term widow's weeds comes from, because 1800s crepe looks a lot like Spanish moss, just kind of weaved together, so it looks like weeds just kind of draped over the dress.
Okay, thank you. And again, my audience, bear with me here. I'm in a very different format, and so I'm catching comments as I can, but at my parents' house with rather meager technology, so it's just I'm trying to catch everything as it comes along. But our friend Joe Rizzo did pose a question which I think is important, and that is, what you've been talking about, is that reserved specifically for women's immediate relatives, or do you see these stages of mourning enacted for public figures? And so we know, of course, if we're looking at the Confederacy, Stonewall Jackson's death in May of 1863 is something that receives a lot of attention throughout the slaveholding South. And so is there a expected public response among white women?
Not in that case, if only because it is the middle of the war and everyone's preoccupied with trying to survive in general. But you do see after the war, for Abraham Lincoln, everybody ends up wearing mourning. There is no one who's off to the side going, no, I'm not going to do that.
And I think too, what you often see is iconography within homes. So you see imagery of someone like Jackson or someone like Lincoln, often draped in black crepe, thin black wool. there is this expectation. Many homes throughout the antebellum era had images of Washington. There were potentially celebratory, but also I think kind of commemorating, memorializing Washington as a figure. So there's some nuance there. Another longtime listener, sorry, the questions are starting to come fast and furious here, Katlin, asks, how does a woman know when she's entered a certain stage of mourning? So you gave the one figure of 1 year and 1 day. So I think it might be useful to start to distinguish these mourning stages by sort of a rough time frame.
Okay. So basically the time frames that these women would go off of are stated in the ladies' magazines of the time, if you can find it. I realized through doing capstone that those are really hard to find, but they are there. Of typically for a husband, you are mourning for 1 year and a day. For a parent figure, somewhere around 6 months. That include for siblings, it would also be closer to 6 months, and then for children, it would be somewhere around 3. Some of that varies depending on which book you look at and who you specifically are, because obviously those could be lengthened or shortened, but that general time frame socially was, this is how long you're supposed to do it. Don't go outside of that, which throughout the war made it a little bit more interesting because a lot of them just never came out of it. So they were talked about a lot.
We're going to have sorry, like I said, technology here is not great. We're going to have a later program where we will be talking in greater detail about some of this long-term mourning rituals and how these processes evolve over time. I think it's useful to also note that when women are in mourning for a spouse, that means too that they are essentially kind of cloistered and closed off. Whereas if a man were to lose a wife, there is some social expectation that he won't remarry immediately, but the prohibition is profoundly different between these two arenas. And as Katlin noted, there are many women who never remarry. And I think they receive a great deal of social approbation for that choice, as being somehow righteous or honorable. And again, one of our future guests.
If I may, with Queen Victoria, as I said, some people actually start to complain about what is perceived as almost obsessive mourning. She and Prince Albert are married for 21 years, and then after his death, she lives for decades, and she never comes out of mourning. It's 40 years of mourning, basically. And if you look at all of her older year photographs, you can still see that she's still in some degree of mourning or another. There are many, many women, I think, and I don't know if they're not, I don't know, Katlin, do you have any sense? Is there any aspiration? You know, this is the queen who is exhibiting this high level of dedication to the ritual of mourning, and she's not stepping away from it no matter what. Is there any sense of there being, are people looking up to this across the ocean, or is it just a thing of the times?
Yes and no. I feel like that depends on who you look at, because for the really high ups in society, they are looking across the ocean, but then there are those farther down in society who I feel like, especially right before the war and during the war, the losses are so great that it just feels wrong to come out of something like that wearing color.
I think too, along the vein of Queen Victoria, Mary is often criticized for maybe excess emotional display, maybe bearing her losses too publicly. And so again, I think there's a really difficult line that these women have to walk, where they adhere to certain social expectations and certain social behaviors, but it's a very closed, cloistered idea where they can't project too much of any specific type of emotion. I mean, I think that's part and parcel of that Victorian culture too, which Katlin alluded, and what makes some of these 19th century actors so difficult to understand is what they're willing to say publicly is often a construct, and we have trouble sometimes drilling down and gain some of the more visceral reactions to these very traumatic events. Again, that's why this Buck entry was so powerful to me, because you sort of follow this man's steps as he's going through these different emotions, as he's sort of feeling this whole range of uncertainty and then eventually just profound loss, and then trying to think toward what the next steps are going to be. There's a couple interesting questions emerging on here. One offers this idea of distinguishing between depression and mourning. And so I might offer a little bit, and then do you want to take it away, Katlin?
Sure.
Even the term depression itself is something that 19th century Americans wouldn't really use. They would use ideas like, they would call it the blues. That's often referred to. Sad hearts is a little more technical, but that often circulates in these materials. And there is this expectation that you will feel very profound loss. And that's not something that they necessarily shy away of. It's something that they certainly share in a pretty closed social circle. The problem with the Civil War is, of course, that there's 750,000 Americans who are killed. And so there's this national sense of loss with which people have to deal. There's this national sense of obligation that the Union feels to its dead, and that's why they start the national cemeteries. And so I wouldn't call that mourning. I wouldn't call that depression, rather. I would say that's moving into the realm of sort of mourning, commemoration, memorialization. But depression or the blues, that's something that I think is often projected internally through diaries and letters, discussed within closed sacred circles of family members and kin, but is something that I don't think you're allowed to outwardly project in any sort of really tangible way, because by so doing, you're sort of breaking some of those veneers that are part and parcel of the Victorian cosmology. But let me, both Katlin and Katlin, feel free to weigh in with what you all think.
Yeah, I think the question of depression is something that's really hard to analyze from our position where we are today. There's, I'm feeling sad. I feel depressed, and then there's the actual condition of depression, which can exist with or without mourning, and is its own creature. And I don't know that we have enough evidence to unless we have those primary sources that we can examine from our perspective with 21st education of mental health. I don't know. Katlin, do you have any input?
I don't think there's necessarily a distinction there, especially if that depression is during mourning. Because like you two have said, you can't really see it necessarily in the sources that we have. There's no good way of finding it. But I feel like in a weird way you could possibly see it. Like not where there would be a line drawn necessarily, but in the material culture of all of it. Like who's in it the longest, and if they're still wearing a veil so that you can't see their face anymore, they're probably still depressed. Whereas if you're walking around with the veil pulled back, you're probably fine for the most part. But past that, I'm not sure there's really a good way to find a distinct line there.
Yeah, those are good points. And one of the audience members just did say they used the word melancholy. That's exactly right. Melancholy pops up quite a bit in the 19th century letters. And actually, there's another letter collection at UVA that I looked at, and it was a school teacher. He eventually enlists in a Virginia artillery unit, but he's in his early 20s, a graduate of UVA. He's sent out to Christiansburg, which is near today Virginia Tech, which was founded after the Civil War. And he's in charge of a class of like 15 or 20 young pupils, and he's away from home, and he succumbs to really severe, what he calls melancholy. And what's interesting is he starts a diary, and he tries to sort of understand it and document it. And so in this case, it's entirely separate from any sort of loss. He hasn't lost anyone. He's lost his community. He's lost his sense of home, but he hasn't grappled with death. But what I think is so compelling, particular source, Clement Fishburne, I think is the name. I can't quite recall. I'll have it on my desk. But he was trying to sort of parse out all these different emotions, and he actually referred to different writings, different dictionaries, to try to understand it. But I think the broader point that both Katlin and Caitlin have alluded to is quite right, that these things are sort of melded together in some sense. And I think most importantly, getting back to the material culture, the stages of mourning are the projections of a sense of depression and loss, right? I mean, that's the whole point of this material culture, is that these women can't outwardly articulate, they can certainly, but they're not allowed to this profound sense of loss, I think, in many instances in public venues. So therefore, they quite literally wear their emotions on their sleeve, right? The material culture is doing the heavy lifting, the heavy cultural lifting that's expected of, again, quote unquote, expected of a Victorian era woman. And so that's why I think this material culture is so compelling and so telling, is that it spoke to 19th century Americans, and it speaks to us today. And if I may, Caitlin, I want to go to your capstone just ever so briefly. I grilled her then, but she got an A. Everything's good. But you had this really interesting example of a dress that maybe you could speak to ever so briefly, that had gone through several different life forms, essentially. Can you talk about that ever so briefly? Do you mind?
Yeah. So
Okay.
that dress that is at the I can never remember the name of it now. The Virginia Civil War Museum, I think
The
it is
American
now.
the American Civil War Museum.
Yeah. Basically, it was first made in the 1830s by, I believe it was the grandmother, but this dress went through 3 different women till it landed with the last woman who wore it during the war, and then after, for possibly 7 different people. There were a lot of losses in the family by the end of the American Civil War, but the progression of that dress was really cool to look at, because you could see where it was lengthened and shortened for each woman who wore it. You could see where it was trimmed and fixed for the time period in which it was worn. That one was a cool one.
And I think it just shows how adaptable these garments are. I mean, there's been some questions in the comments about, does this apply to lower class women? And again, to some extent, certainly not. They just don't have the material wherewithal to do all this. But what's so interesting about the 18th and 19th centuries is garments are made to last, in some cases for decades, if not generations. There's a burst of light. And they're modified. And so women would often, if I'm not mistaken, Caitlin, they would over dye existing garments black as they entered into stages of mourning. So they're using existing clothing that they have, and to this very important cultural work of mourning.
Yeah. There were, yeah. the dyeing of some of those dresses gets really funky to look at, because that's one of those things that all classes were doing. Even for the lowest of classes, you would find your darkest, probably brown work dress and dye it even darker if you could. But most of the dyes that they were using were really finicky, for lack of a better word, because you would over dye it as best you could so that the color wouldn't leach out of the material, but at the same time you could possibly get sick from it and have all sorts of other complications. Yeah.
Good. And it's important to note that these are transcendent, north and south, the things that we're talking about here. Katlin has, in her capstone work, primarily studied the Upper South. And so a lot of her discussion is pertaining specifically to the experiences of white Southern women. But a lot of the ideals that we're talking about, as Catherine has hinted at, are they go across the Atlantic. Globally, it's a very different discussion, but they go across the Atlantic to Great Britain, pockets of Europe, certainly. This is very much true for middle and upper class women, both North and South, for this period. But I think it's another useful point to touch on here that was brought up earlier, and our friend Jan mentioned this, is hair jewelry. And so this is another realm that I think for us in the 21st century is incredibly hard to sort of comprehend and to wrap our minds around. But again, Catherine, if you want to weigh in, so tell us about mourning jewelry, specifically the use of human hair.
So basically, it wasn't just jewelry. When it came to using hair, you can have wreaths made out of it. But in terms of jewelry specifically, you could have it put into a brooch. We have different pieces here of earrings and watch fobs, different things like that, that basically, since photography was such a fairly new thing, using the loved one's hair was a way to keep them with you. It's a really long, drawn-out process to make. By the 1860s, you can actually take a piece of their hair and have it sent to businesses up in the north, where they're supposed to be making hair jewelry or whatever you want out of that hair. Half the time you would get it back and it wouldn't be the right color anymore, but you could. But basically, it's just a way to keep that person with you, which is why it would still be worn even after the stages of mourning and the mourning process as a whole. Just kind of as a token. That's not quite the right way to put it, but
I think it's useful to say too that, that for middle and upper class Americans, there is also the phenomenon of postmortem photography, in which in some cases a deceased child, a deceased loved one, their image is captured and again is displayed very prominently in the home. Our friend, some of our friends have talked about this. Dan Schoaf, who's tuned in this evening, has talked about the phenomenon of postmortem photography. And this is yet another tangible connection that 19th century Americans are trying to make to loved ones who have passed. And what I guess I always say is, we have so many images in most circumstances of family members who we know that are deceased, that we have just a whole variety of ways to remember them in all sorts of different phases of their life and all sorts of different scenarios and interactions. And that's simply not the case in the 19th century. And so these tokens, as Katlin said, I think that term's exactly right. These tokens of remembrance are just incredibly powerful. And again, this is largely middle and upper classes that we're talking about here. But if you go to some prominent homes where Grant passed away for instance, as with many rooms where a president has passed, they basically stop time and they create a very elaborate hair wreath, which is one of the only things that they moved into that room after Grant had passed away. And these are incredibly elaborate pieces of almost art that again resonated in very powerful ways among 19th century Americans in ways that I think today we find very macabre and just very difficult, I think, to fully understand. So, Katlin, did you have anything to add to that?
I can't speak so much to the hair jewelry aspect, but just again to underscore what you were saying about it's just this effort to almost pause time, that moment before when this person was still with us. You know, the hair is something touchable. In Queen Victoria's case, she keeps Albert's rooms as he left them, and keeps the whole house in mourning. But those rooms are preserved, and a lot of people find this very eerie. But she needs that space to exist as it was in that moment before, when he was still alive.
Yeah, no, I think that's powerful. Okay. I feel like we're coming to a good place here. So I said at the beginning that this was going to be a depressing conversation, but I think it's been anything but. It's actually been quite illuminating and enlightening. Again, to those of you tuning in, I've tried to catch the questions as they come along. Again, the technology where I'm at isn't the best, and so I'm trying to sort of work as well as I can, but it seems like everything is more or less stable. Do you have any final sentiments, Katlin, that you would like to express?
I think the only, just kind of to touch on that last point one more time, where the upper classes were using the hair jewelry, for lower classes, it wasn't hair necessarily, but you could also use buttons or pieces of shirts that they might have worn constantly. Something else very tangible that connected specifically to that person. It wasn't always hair. So.
Yeah, thank you. Katlin?
If I may jump even further across the ocean for a moment, and it may, there is a point in the story, I promise. My father's family is from a very small country called Estonia, and it was occupied by the Soviet Union for about half a century, which kind of kept progress in check for a while, with many aspects of society. And when I first began to visit there, and we would look at the albums at the time, the photo albums from the 70s and 80s, all the photos are from funerals. And I asked them, why are we just all the photos in these albums, thick albums, are just from funerals, people gathering at funerals. There's nothing else happening in these albums. So why is this? And here's the point of why I'm telling this story. It's we want to be with them one last time. This is how we hold our family together. We want to be with them. We want to be able to look back and have this last moment when we were all together. So even though it does seem a little gruesome perhaps to our sentimentalities to have funeral pictures around a coffin, I think it's just part of that same sentiment that we see in the 19th century of trying to find some means of carrying that with us. And I think that's part of the human emotion that kind of resonates across time. Mourning is hard, and no matter what the cause is that takes someone that we love away from us. And whatever we can do, even if we're not battling full-on depression about it, whatever we can do to hold that person dear, I think matters greatly.
Thank you. That's a beautiful sentiment. To those of you tuning in, thank you. There's actually a great deal of scholarship on this subject. Actually, a work of fiction that's a very interesting work of fiction. Lincoln in the Bardo was mentioned earlier, and it's a fascinating book that I think actually be worth talking about with two of my colleagues in the English department. But it's this interesting meditation on death that takes excerpts from Lincoln's life with the loss of one of his sons. Lincoln's Melancholy, which is nonfiction, is a footnoted work, but also very interesting meditation on melancholy and mourning and death. Drew Faust's This Republic of Suffering talks a great deal about mourning rituals, as does her book Mothers of Invention, and Awaiting the Heavenly Country, which came out right around the time of Faust, is another great book on sort of the culture of death in the 19th century. And there's many others. Maybe we'll work on the comments section tomorrow. So to you all, with those very nice sentiments, I guess, thank you. We deeply appreciate your time and bearing with us here with some of the technology hiccups that at least I've been seeing on my end. Hopefully the program's been more seamless on yours. Thank you especially to Katlin. Again, Katlin was one of my great students at Shepherd. We really appreciate what she did for us as a student, and the legacy that she now carries on through her work as a living history interpreter and someone who does take material culture and the study of 19th century America quite seriously. And Catherine, we still don't see each other in the office, but here we are in our virtual space. So it's always good to see you until we're able to, I guess, reopen. We'll continue to do this like so. Next week and the week thereafter, we have a whole host of programs, including a program about a week and a half from now on mourning and marriage in the 19th century. Two really good scholars, Angela Elder and Allison Fredette. So some of the themes that we'll be talking about, that we talked about today, will be extended in this future program. And so with that, thank you all very much for your time this evening. The Black Velvet is a very specific type of drink. I did not hazard to make it. I made a kind of poor version of the Corpse Reviver, which Catherine and I had also talked about, which is actually quite good. I would encourage you all to read some of the titles that are being mentioned on the comments section. And again, I'll go back and backfill a bit too. And so with that, please stay safe, healthy, and well. And so I wish everyone a very good evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you.